All right, I believe we can get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project. We're very happy to welcome our good friend, Andy Merrifield. We've presented the various other conversations with Andy on several occasions, and we look forward to more. Andy's an independent scholar and author of a dozen books and numerous articles, essays, and reviews about urbanism, social theory, and literature in major publications. He's published intellectual biographies of Henri Lefebvre, Guy Debord, and John Berger. Andy says that he has tried to live, think, and write, as James Joyce once said, in the broadest way imaginable. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andy to talk to us today, 2 days after Bloomsday, about James Joyce, Karl Marx, and Henri Lefebvre. Welcome,
Thank you,
Andy.
Fred. Okay, thank you. That's quite an introduction. It does sound a little bit pretentious, but I do like that idea of the living the broadest way imaginable, because it always puts the copy editors a little bit of problems. I've used it a few times in some of the things I've written, but they always seem to alter it to imaginable, and I say no, it's not imaginable. It's a combination between having imagination and also being marginal. So I think all of us, perhaps, who support the MEP to some degree, live in the broadest way imaginable. So it was just a very nice Joycean play, and I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that a bit later. I might even come back to that same phrase. But thank you for hosting me. Always a pleasure to talk here and to talk to everybody. This is a kind of presentation which would work much better in person, I think, with a glass of Guinness or some dry white wine that Joyce you like to tipple. So it is a little bit difficult just to talk about something so that I actually find so passionate and so fascinating to just a two-dimensional screen. So it's quite difficult. I wish we were together. That's all I could say. Somewhere, someplace. But I guess that would be quite difficult anyway. So maybe we should just do what we can here and try and live in some way with what we have with Zoom, and just be glad that we can communicate in this way this Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening it is for me. So thank you for being here. And I'm very sorry that Michael Lardner can't be here. I wish Michael a speedy recovery, and it's doubly poignant that he can't be here in the sense that this was Michael's idea. I had a wonderful walk in April around from the Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park City over into Brooklyn, where he picked up the mail for NEP, and we just did a lot of talking, a lot of thinking, and a lot of brainstorming. And it was Michael who suggested that this is something he would like me to do. So I'm very sorry he's not here, but I wish him all the best. But I am a little bit I don't feel a fraud, but I feel a little bit uneasy because I did a PhD on Marx, so I suppose I can put my hat on and think, I'm a kind of professional Marx scholar. I mean, it sounds horrible to say that, but it is a kind of, I have some sort of, some credentials to talk about it, whereas I have no credentials whatsoever to talk about James Joyce, other than the fact that he's somebody I've read for, God knows, sort of 35 years, probably more. Off and on. So I talk, and I will be talking about him as a rank amateur, as a little bit somebody who has a sort of obsessive attraction to him. I don't know what it is. He does seem to be a writer that does attract obsessive kinds of people. There used to be the story about Beckett, who was a friend, and at one point a kind of assistant to Joyce, who used to idolize Joyce so much that he wanted to wear the same kind of tennis shoe that James Joyce wore, including the same size, which were about three sizes smaller than, I think, Beckett's own foot. So and if you see some of the pictures of Joyce always sitting cross-legged, you can see these kind of battered old white sneakers. I never saw a picture of Beckett in his and how he walked in them, but he was always idolizing Joyce. And the same actually goes for Fitzgerald, Scott Fitzgerald. There's a wonderful story about the first time that some of you may have heard. But the first time that Fitzgerald met James Joyce, it was in 1928, I think it was, the summer of 1928 in Paris, at an apartment. It was a dinner party given by Sylvia Beach, one of the co-owners of the Shakespeare and Company, the wonderful bookstore in Paris, who ended up publishing Ulysses out of their own money initially. And Fitzgerald apparently was so overwhelmed with Joyce's company, they went down on his knees in front of him, and Joyce was very embarrassed. And later in the evening, he said he was going to throw himself out the apartment window as a gesture of loyalty to Joyce. And then Joyce had to grab hold of him. And this was a time when Joyce's eyesight wasn't very good. So he managed to grab Fitzgerald. And afterwards he said, that young man, we better watch him. He's going to do some harm to himself. So obviously he kind of did in his own way, but maybe not in the way that James Joyce anticipated. So there's a lot of people who are obsessive, almost kind of amateur Joycean readers. There's also a great story about the quantum theorist Murray Gell Mann, who was a Nobel laureate for discovering an atomic particle inside the proton or the neutron, that neutrons and protons behaved weirdly, and they were themselves composite. And he said he was an insufferable reader of Joyce as well. And one day he was flicking through Finnegan's Wake and he suddenly found the line, 3 quarks for Mr. Mark. And he thought, quark, that's what it is, a quark. It's a 3 thing. And suddenly it's become inaugurated, and it's basically a common scientific term for quantum theorists, that the quark, and this came from Finnegan's Wake. Another obsessive reader of Finnegan's Wake was Joseph Mitchell. Some of you may have read of some of Joseph Mitchell's stories that he used to publish in the 30s and 40s and 50s in the New Yorker, about probably the last time that the New Yorker wrote about ordinary people. They weren't celebrities. But he apparently was a member of the James Joyce Society in New York. And these James Joyce societies do exist across the world. And you hear these weird stories that they've been meeting every month to read Finnegan's Wake for the last 25 years. And they're sort of only the quarter of the way through. So it does attract obsessive. So I would kind of put myself in this very strange obsessive Joycean category that picks him up and reads him. And also, anytime I go to a used bookstore and I see an edition of any of his work, I always have to buy it. So I probably got about 25 different versions of Ulysses and numerous different versions of Finnegan's Wake. And I don't know what it is that attracts. But it's a pleasure to talk here on the 100th anniversary of Bloomsday, Thursday. And actually, it was on a Thursday. It's a bit weird, really, because I noticed one of the tweets was sent and it said the 118th anniversary of Bloomsday, which strictly speaking is actually correct, because Bloomsday, the day that Ulysses takes place, is June 16th, 1904, which was the day that Joyce had his first date with Nora Barnacle, who would soon become his wife, Nora Joyce. And so when we think about 1904, then it is 118 years since 1904. So strictly speaking, it is the 118th anniversary. But given that Ulysses wasn't published until February 1922, February the 2nd, actually, it was published on James Joyce's 40th birthday, then the first Bloomsday, strictly speaking, was June 16th, 1922, i.e. 100 years ago, last Thursday. So just to clear up a few little things. One thing that just was published this year, which I've got to show you, talking about obsessive Joyceans. And it's a wonderful photograph on the front. It's a great brick of a version of Ulysses. And this was just published not long ago, a few months ago, by an independent press based in New York called The Other Press. And it's a series of illustrations that were done by the Spanish artist called Eduardo Arroyo. And he spent many, many years, he's an artist you would describe as a surrealist, almost a graphic artist. And there were some just incredible drawings in there. Some of them are almost Dada. And there must be almost 100 drawings that Aurelio did over the course of about 40 years about Finnegan, about Ulysses. Now, Aurelio is an interesting character because in the 50s, he was a socialist, a communist. He got out, a Marxist, got out of Franco's Spain in the late 50s, went to live in Paris, became very close to Althusser and a lot of the Althusserian ways of thinking in the 1960s. And some of you may know his art without knowing it. There's a famous painting that was done in 1969 called La Dacha. And it's a picture that looks like it could have been done by David Hockney. It looks like a Californian type house, very open, and with glass windows on the one side. And it's a sort of satire against structuralism and post-structuralist thought, French style. And in it, there's a picture. There's an armchair where Claude Lévi-Strauss is sitting as a kind of holding court. And over the way, there's Michel Foucault, looks to be scratching his bald head, looking rather bored. Walking in with what looked like a tray of coffee is Roland Barthes. He looked like he'd been making the coffee. And directly standing up, facing what would have been the author, the painter, was Jacques Lacan with his bow tie, looking very dandy. But if you look at the image of the painting, right outside the glass door, almost on the terrace, there's a shadowy figure, and the shadowy figure is none other than Louis Althusser. And it's a great picture, and it was done. It was a collective drawing, a painting, but one of the major artists was Aurelio, and he also did this incredible one called the Marxist Brothers Cabin that he did in the 1990s, with bearing the subtitle "Or a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man." So this guy, Althusserian Marxist, was also somebody who was intimately into Joyce, and that really lights my fire in some ways, because not only have I been a bit of an obsessive reader of Joyce, but I just like finding any kind of connection through people, through art, through different modes of cultural life. People who have an interest in Karl Marx and James Joyce, as I do. And Aurelio very much fits that bill with these paintings that he did, his illustrations of Ulysses. So if you've got a birthday coming up, or maybe you want to put it on your Christmas list, because this thing cost about $75. It's a great tome. It's wonderfully illustrated. It's very hard and heavy to hold out, but check it out. And also, it is the text of Ulysses too, so you can read the book as well as see these incredible images. So that bodes the question then about what is the relationship between Marx and Joyce? Well, the simple question is there isn't one. There's no relationship, other than the fact that when he lived in Trieste, Joyce was apparently a very ardent and avid reader of Avanti, which was, of course, the Italian socialist newspaper, one time edited regionally by Antonio Gramsci. And it's clear that his politics, whilst they were a little bit elusive, were very much progressive and on the left. He called himself a socialistic artist. So it's clear that when you look at the characters in his writings, that he has a great affinity and a great sympathy, as well as a great disdain, it has to be said, for ordinary people. In all their joy and all their horror. And I think this idea of him being somebody sympathetic to the downtrodden, to the working classes, and sort of déclassé middle classes as well, of which he would categorize himself, is very much the constituency that not only I think Joyce is appealing to, but also they populate his text in different ways. In the way in which in the most everyday ordinariness. Now, the question of everyday ordinariness was very much something on the mind of Henri Lefebvre. Now, this is the connection I think that I like to make between Lefebvre and James Joyce, is this idea of everyday life,
It definitely felt like an out-of-body experience.
I can hear it. Somebody's just got their microphone on. I wonder whether you might be able to just mute that for me, if that's okay. Thank you. Critique of Everyday Life it was Henri Lefebvre's first volume of his study, sociological, philosophical, Marxist study of daily life that he did. It was published for the first time in 1947. Have a look at that book, because the opening pages talk about James Joyce. That actually in a very lucid and an interesting way, as does this book, which opens the first dozen pages, Everyday Life in the Modern World, a book that was published in 1968. Interesting time to think about everyday life in that year. It opens with about 12 pages, a dozen pages, talking about Ulysses and about why Ulysses actually might be something that Marxists might want to read. And here, it's not to suggest that Joyce is a Marxist, and this is a little bit the way I'd like to frame my own dabblings and obsessions with Joyce. It's not that you can look and show Joyce was a Marxist here, he said this, he said that, this is what one of the characters said, it's more actually that there's plenty in these books around everyday life, around different aspects of humanity, around different aspects of politics, that actually, that it's a great interest for socialists to look at, to actually take things from, to get inspired by certain things, even certain words, which I'll come back to later, certain words of Finnegan's Wake, some of these incredible puns that Joyce uses, spark off things which, it doesn't matter whether Joyce meant that, it's the way in which you can appropriate it, be inspired by it, gain some kinds of insight that in your particular kind of walk of life, or your particular occupation, or your particular writing, or your particular politics, it can set off some buzzers that can actually lead to all kinds of different things. And again, I'm going to come back to that a bit later, but it's to talk about Joyce, not to show that he was a Marxist, but just to suggest that actually we can, as Marxists, as socialists, we can read these books and glean things from them for our own agendas. And I don't think that's unfair. I think that these books are so open, so polyvocal, so heterogeneous, so elusive in their meanings, that they are fair game to be appropriated and reappropriated, just the same way as way in which Marx was appropriating Ricardo or Adam Smith or various other people. They're there as tools to be used and to be thought of imaginatively, used imaginatively, not as exegesis. Joyce said this, therefore that, just to use them in an imaginative way. And this is what's quite nice about Henri Lefebvre, in the sense that he uses it everyday life. Now, the concept everyday life in itself could warrant a whole session, because it's a tricky thing to nail down. But I guess in a nutshell, the kind of time that Henri Lefebvre wrote this was, I suppose, when you were thinking that how can you appeal, how can, in terms of the masses, be turned on to socialism? And he was very clear that they're not going to get turned on by 5-year plans or something which is very abstract, even though that might be important for running an economy, and indeed is. It has to be something that's a little bit more lived, a little bit more experiential, a little bit more everyday, something that's a bit more media for people to grasp and understand. And his idea was that, that Marxism could become that. It could become a sort of a philosophy of everyday life, with a view to change everyday life, with a view to think that everyday life is ambivalent. It's has all the experiences, all the fetishisms, reifications that you can imagine a commodity culture would bring. People go shopping, people are encountering ideology every time they walk down the street or put on a TV or listen to a commercial radio. So everyday life and leisure is full of alienation and reification and commodification, and it's been colonized by capitalism. But at the same time, it's the only space, the only starting point to imagine some kind of revolutionary transformation. It's the starting point of the realization of the possible, is one of the things Henri Lefebvre says. He has a more poetic time, and he says that everyday life is a supreme court where wisdom, knowledge, and justice, wisdom, power, and knowledge are brought to judgment, I think is the quote. And it's actually a rather interesting way to think that, in other words, there's nothing outside of everyday life. Everyday life is where we begin and where we end, and what must be transformed in some form of collective practice that can be answerable to everyday life, to transform everyday life, to make the ordinary maybe a little less ordinary, or to make it in some way that would be not only about livelihood, but also about liberation. So Henri Lefebvre is playing around with the dialectic of the everyday in these ways, and he begins the book with Ulysses. Now, Ulysses is a book which is profoundly dialectical in a way. There are lots of ambiguities, lots of antagonisms, even the antagonism between the young Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom is an artistic, scientific, realist type of dreamer on the one hand, realist on the other, poet artist on the one hand, much more of a common ordinary man on the other, and every man who is incredibly ordinary. And actually Joyce was the first novelist that actually gave an urban man, Leopold Bloom, who has absolutely no importance in the world at all, some kind of epic consequence. That him walking around Dublin was the equivalent of Odeus going around in the Homer's Odyssey. And so the idea then that the everyday could be not only ordinary, but the everyday is epic. And also the everyday is transformative. There's a very interesting encounter early on in Ulysses in the second episode, which is Nestor, which has the young Stephen Dedalus, who appeared in the Portrait of the Artist of the Young Man as a scholar, now has a teaching job at a private school in Dublin. And the headmaster is a bigoted, fairly reactionary conservative called Mr. Deasy. And toward the end of that chapter, Mr. Deasy is paying Stephen Dedalus his wages in his office. And they start talking about history. And Mr. Deasy say that history is the will of God, is the manifestation of God. And Stephen Dedalus has this wonderful line when he says, that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken, which, is quite near to what Marx said in the 18th Brumaire. And then he goes through pointing his thumb outside, because the school kids are playing hockey and there's all kinds of shouts and whistles. And he said, that is God, that is history. And Mr. Deasy says, what? And Stephen says, a shout in the street. So it's a shout in the street. So it's interesting the way Joyce is framing that, because the street is almost one of the protagonists of Ulysses. The streets of Dublin figure almost as the star of the book. And it's a great book of urban wandering. And I think this was something that Michael Lardner and I spoke about when we had this in April. We had this great get together one afternoon when we went from the Irish Hunger Memorial in Battery Park City in New York, in Lower Manhattan. We walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, and we walked into Brooklyn, and we were just sort of wandering around. And this is a little bit the way in which Bloom spends his day. He's actually working because he does have a day job. He's a sort of ad canvasser for a newspaper called the Freeman Journal. So he's going about his paid work, but he's going around encountering different people in Dublin throughout the day. And there's something actually quite heartwarming to think about Bloom, because Bloom is a kind of ordinary man. But also he's not really an ordinary man. He's a little bit ill at ease and marginal in provincial Dublin at that time, particularly a Dublin that had some kind of an island that had nationalistic tendencies that he found were very narrow. And Leopold Bloom had a Jewish father, so he had a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, and he was, according to the book, you get the impression he has been baptized, but it's clear that his Jewish heritage is very important, and it's somewhere that makes him feel out of place. And indeed, it's one way in which a lot of the people in Dublin of a certain generation and a certain political credence put him out of place, that he doesn't really belong in it. So it's clear that Bloom is an insider, yet an outsider, somebody who's a progressive. We could almost say he's a socialist if we can look at some of the things that he was saying. He was somebody that felt an outsider. He felt somewhat suffocated, as Stephen Dedalus did, with a narrow provincial life. He felt that his view of life was much more continental than it was Irish. And his derives and his wanderings around Dublin really reflect that idea of being an insider and an outsider. But one thing they also reflect is just what a dignified character he was, in a sense. Each interaction he has, each encounter he has in the book, through the 18 episodes, there's something really quite nice to see how he treats people with mutual respect and dignity and decorum. And in one scene, he's talking about making eye contact with them. Make sure you make eye contact. So he's a great man who's very much into justice and being dignified in his encounters. And this was really interesting to think about somebody who could be seen as a public man, because he spends a lot of time in the public realm. A lot of the days are spent wandering around. He has his internal monologues, but it's almost like the internal monologues are in some way stimulated and heightened by the way in which he's wandering around the public realm. So he's almost like this kind of public citizen that's walking around. And at one point in the book, he puts his finger over one eye and he's looking at an object. And then he puts his finger over the other eye and he's walking past the Dunsink Observatory in Dublin. Or he thinks about the Dunsink Observatory because there's a bell that chimes. And then he starts to ponder that actually the Dunsink Observatory is 25 minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. And he starts to think, why is this? And one of the words he uses here is a word which I think is tremendously important and actually really quite rich to think about. And that is the idea of parallax. This idea of parallax, that you can look at an object through one eye. If you cover it, I'm looking at a picture now, it's in one place. But if you cover the other eye and look at it, it seems to have moved from that place. And of course, the idea of the two observatories, Dunsink in Dublin and Greenwich Mean Time in London, was that when each observatory was looking at the sun was in a different part of the sky. So there's been a sort of shift. So it's looking at the same object in different ways. So it's the exact opposite of a binocular vision, if you like. So it's not just seeing things singularly, it's being able to see things through binoculars that can see things almost dialectically. I think of sort of Marx, rather than base capital on the industrial bourgeoisie or industrial capitalism, which is pretty much what David Ricardo and Adam Smith did. Marx was able to see what capital could look like through two different lenses, what it looked like from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie and capital when they're going about their business, they're in the hidden abode, but what that also looks like from the views of the working class. So on the other end of that parallactic type of vision. And Bloom is constantly playing around with these ideas to the degree that he actually gets ridiculed by some of the cronies in the pubs for, on the one hand this, or but don't you see they're joking because he's trying to see things in its all-round totality, and rather than to see things in a very blinkered way. Now, the classic case of the blinkered way is the notion of the Cyclops, which is probably the most political episode in Ulysses. The idea of the Cyclops, which takes place later in the day. I think the Cyclops is the 12th episode, and it's taking place around 5 o'clock in a pub called Barney Kiernan's. Now, Bloom goes into the pub, and he's on the hunt for a guy called Martin Cunningham. But sitting in the corner of the pub, and I suspect that some of you who've read Ulysses will have absolutely read this episode, because it is his most political, I think. Sitting in the corner is a character that Joyce calls the citizen. Now, the citizen is, alas, somebody we quite recognize today in our own political landscape. He's a sort of ultra-nationalist. He certainly wouldn't feel ill at ease in post-Brexit Britain. The guy wouldn't feel ill at ease in Trump's America either. This guy is a bullying, aggressive, ultra-nationalist. He's an Irish nationalist, it's true, but he only sees one thing, and that is just free Ireland. And Joyce, whilst he supported Irish home rule, was much more nuanced in the way in which he saw that. He was much more nuanced in the way that somebody like Parnell perhaps would have taken it. Rather than this guy, the Cyclops, which was based on a guy called John Cusack, who was a real character, actually an Irish Gaelic football player, who was very much narrow-minded in his ultra-nationalists. He was also an anti-Semite, and he was also a bigot. And in the pub, the Bloom encounters the citizen. And I just thought maybe I'll just read a couple of lines from this, if that's okay, about what goes on between the citizen and Bloom, if I can find my place. This is a section in Cyclops. This is on page 272 of my Penguin edition of Ulysses, which is the corrected version that was done by Hans Walter Gabler, which I might say something about later on. I may not, but I might do, about this correction. And this is Bloom having a confab, as it were, with the citizen. Now, the citizen, I should say, is described by Joyce as this figure seated on a large boulder at the foot of a round tower. So he's being metaphorical about the Cyclops. And he describes him as a broad-shouldered, all one word, deep-chested, all one word, strong-limbed, red-haired, freely freckled, shaggy beard, wide-mouthed, large-nosed, long-headed, deep voice, bare-kneed, brawny-handed, hairy-legged, ruddy-faced, sinewy-armed hero. Now, if that doesn't sound like a proud boy, I don't know what does. You know, it's he's almost sort of, he has this mangy mongrel, as Joyce calls it, sitting next to him, who's kind of frothing at the mouth, ready to bite somebody. And you get the sense that this same kind of aggression is it's a menacing scene when the citizen talks. He's talking in this menacing way. You can almost imagine getting ready to tweet something and storm the Capitol. You know, but the definition of him is hilarious if you have a look at it, and it's Joyce's definition of the citizen as this one-eyed giant Cyclops. Later on in the episode, the citizen says, "What is your nation, if I may ask?" "Ireland," says Bloom. "I was born here, Ireland." And a bit later, Bloom says, "And I belong to a race too," says Bloom, "that is hated and persecuted. Also now, this very moment, this very instant." "But you're talking about the New Jerusalem," says the citizen. "I'm talking about injustice," says Bloom. And the character John Weiss says, "Well, stand up to it then with force like a man." And Bloom says, but it's of no use, says Bloom. Force, hatred, history, all that's not the life for men and women, insult and hatred. And everybody knows that it's the very opposite of what life really is. What, says Alf. Love, says Bloom. I mean the opposite of hatred. I must go now. And he scurries away. He scurries away because he kind of knows he's on very hostile turf. And Bloom is a pacifist that wants standing his ground, but he doesn't want to get involved in any kind of violence. But he comes back. He does stand his ground in a way, because later on he comes back and he says, remember that Karl Marx was a Jew, Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Spinoza was a Jew, and even the sort of savior was a Jew. And then the citizen goes, by Jesus, I'll brain that bloody Jew man for using a holy name. And he picks up this biscuit tin to try and throw at Bloom. And this is where the scene ends, with the citizen running after Bloom and picking up a biscuit tin and throwing it away. And Bloom hops into a cab, which has this brilliant illustration by Aurelio. As the dog comes chasing after him, the mangy mongrel comes after Bloom. I wonder if I can find the picture. It's a lovely picture of Bloom in his cab making a hasty exit from the citizen. This is a great episode, and I think that the Bloom kind of makes his point really about this. But this idea of parallax is something that is quite good to think about, because it's probably one of the reasons that Ulysses is such a damn difficult book to read, in the sense that it has this paralytic drift. Paralytic, that's probably, if that's a word, a drift around parallax that goes very quickly from the first person to the third person. So you're reading the text and you're hearing Bloom's inner monologue, which go on throughout the day. But suddenly the narrative shifts to a he or a they or a her. And we've shifted then from the first person to the third person, and it's done it in a almost like kind of sleight of hand that confuses the reader. And that is why it's often very nice just to get a CD or get it on, I don't know, on Spotify or something, and actually listen to Ulysses being read, particularly being read by many different people, because then you can hear the voices change. So you can hear the Bloom's monologue to himself, ruminating about himself, but then you can also get the sense the voice changes, and you know then that it's a third person narrator who's somewhere outside of what's going on in the thinking head. But that parallax is something I think actually quite fascinating to think about today, because it's almost suggesting that Bloom is a person who can think as an I, but also think as a we. He can think as a person who has rights, and he knows that well, because he feels anti-Semitism, and he feels his rights are being somehow offended in the time of he's living in Ireland. So he's an I that knows his rights, but he's a we that also knows about the collective public as well, and how justice isn't just about the I, but it's about the we. And how it's possible to see perhaps how rights and duties go together in some kind of social contract. So I always tend to see the wanderings of Leopold Bloom around Dublin being the kind of wanderings of a walking social contract incarnate, somebody who knows that he has rights and is prepared to stand up for them, but somebody knows he has collective duties, forms of dignity, respect, equality with the general public, things that are not his, but they're ours. And it's a bit hard for him to imagine not respecting social distance and not respecting a mask and not respecting the broader public, to think like a public, to think like a public as well as the self. It's quite an interesting proposition for Marxists to think about now. There's a right to the city, but also there are certain duties that one has towards a democratic culture to make that a little bit more generalizable. So I always get the idea that this parallax is to be able to think like an I and think like a we, and to know that actually the both are important and how you can kind of piece them together. And it's not favoring one or the other, but it's also embedding them down in daily life to see that actually our relationships with people on a very mundane level, what's epic about them is that actually the humility and the grandeur is a kind of epic thing. It's a deheroization. It's not some kind of grand demagogue standing up there and rallying people on in this cult of personality. It's much more about just a very ordinary kind of democracy that we have to figure out ourselves based at street level. And so that's the sort of the political message I see in this parallax vision. And it's something that comes out very near the end, and in fact at the end of Ulysses. It comes out in episode 17, which is the penultimate episode, which is Ithaca, which is after Bloom and Stephen Dedalus find each other. Stephen's drunk. He was in a brothel and Bloom kind of fetched him there. He had a fight with a British officer who hit him, and you know he's kind of, Bloom wants to look after him, so he takes him back to Eccles Street, which is symbolizing the kind of homecoming of Odeus going back home with Telemachus, and they begin to bond together and have this dialogue, which is a kind of, it's written as a catechism that asks questions about, you know, what kind of disposition did one have, what was the temperament. One had a scientific temperament, the other had an artistic temperament, and it's quite a long episode, but it goes around playing this almost kind of dialogical dialogue that goes between Bloom and Dedalus in the early hours of the morning over a cup of cocoa, and it's very much based on a kind of parallax, and it's a montage. And interestingly enough, this was the episode that was Sergei Eisenstein's favorite, the Russian filmmaker and director, and that was meant to be the formal infrastructure that he wanted to use in his film about Marx's Capital, which never actually got made. But it would have been fascinating to see what kind of movie it might have been, what kind of documentary it might have been, to use Joyce, whom Eisenstein was greatly admired and actually lectured in the Soviet Union several times against much opposition, we might add. But also he wanted to bring that idea of the catechism into a kind of dialogue with Marx's Capital. A fascinating way of thinking. The final episode, Penelope, Molly's in bed thinking about Bloom. Bloom, early hours of the morning, comes back into bed. He's been out on his wanderings, on his odyssey all day. And Molly herself has a parallax view of things, because she is kind of ambivalent about him. She starts off with a yes. The chapter begins with a yes, which is a negative yes, that talks about him being a bit of a sort of dead loss, and she suspects he's up to something. And of course, Molly herself has this peculiar kind of affair with this kind of character called Blazes Boylan, who really seems like a kind of complete, what Joyce probably would call a tosser, and yet Molly seems attracted to him. It looked like they may have had some kind of sexual intercourse during the day. It kind of depressed Bloom. She suspects that he's been having this kind of written affair with some other woman, which is true, but it's just been by letters, and he's covered it up. So she's a little bit negative about him, and they haven't had sex for 11 years, because since the death of their baby Rudy, he died pretty much in childbirth after 11 days, and it's clear that relations between the two have not been the happiest. But later on in the monologue, it's a monologue which is very famous. It's a monologue which doesn't lend itself. It doesn't entirely convince me. It never entirely convinced me. It's much better when you can hear it read aloud, particularly by a woman. It never actually super convinced me that this was what was going on in somebody's head. She was thinking these thoughts. But if you hear it performed by somebody who understands the sensibility that's being conveyed and is able to translate it, it actually can make it rather magnificent, rather than actually reading it, which is quite difficult because there's no punctuation. But it famously ends with an affirmative yes. Yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. And she kind of comes round to Bloom thinking, well, better him than another. And then she's pondering to think, well, actually, Blazes Boylan wasn't any great shakes, to be honest, either. So, you know, why not him? And he understood me when they were getting together. And it ends with a yes. And a lot has been said about this yes, about Joyce being a very positive, a positive man about the world, who ends on an upbeat yes, an affirmative note. The book Finnegan's Wake ends with a the, with a the. Now, I don't know whether you're ready to hear more, because I've been going on a while, but I haven't got to Finnegan's Wake yet. And you've had all these stories about reading it for 25 years and only getting a quarter of the way through. So you may, I don't know whether your patience is gonna last that long.
Andy, I came here specifically to hear about Finnegan's Wake. So
okay. You asked for it, Fred. You asked for it.
So I asked for it. So I think if there's no objection from our friends in the audience, I think you could take another 10 or 15 minutes to.
I didn't mean to go on so long about Ulysses, and I've been talking for quite a while, haven't I? But I've got to admit, and this may be a word of warning, Finnegan's Wake is a little bit my favourite. So be warned. Perhaps you can shut me up after 20 minutes or so, but let's see. I mean, where to begin with Finnegan's Wake? Well, to begin is at the end, and it's the word the. And if you come to the beginning, so it'll say, get my glasses, and it says, away, alone, alast, alove, along the. And if we go to the beginning, we'll come to the word river run, and I can get my page. River run, past even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodius vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. So this is me just looking at it. I suppose reading Marx for many years, it is a bit like what Althusser said, isn't it, about capital? You know, he talks about his reading the capital was not an innocent reading, but a guilty reading. He's not reading it innocently for the pure joy. There's always kind of something going on in his mind. He's guilty of reading it with intent, if you like. And so when I saw the idea that it starts with a the and circulates round again, it's kind of mimicking the flow of the Liffey River, which runs through Finnegan's Wake, as indeed it does run through Ulysses. The river Liffey, the river that goes through Dublin, and actually beyond, it's a very long river, and it goes into the sea, which is important for the end of Finnegan's Wake. But it's the word commodius, which is almost like commodity. Vicus, which is about vico, but something like vicus is a little bit sort of sticky, a commodity being sticky, but it's a word that is recirculation. So commodius recirculation, and something that begins and comes round again, does sound a bit like MCM or CMC, if you're going to use the Marxist sort of commodity. It's almost like we're talking about volume 2 of Capital here. This idea of circulation. This is flow. It's flowing around, even to the degree that Marx uses, he uses MCM, delta M, CMC, as symbols for his shorthand, his siglas, if you want to call it, for his ideas of capital. We have this here with Finnegan's Wake. We have HCE, Here Comes Everybody, which is Humphrey Shimden Earwicker, the protagonist of Finnegan's Wake. And we have ALP, and Olivia Pluribel, which has a sort of delta figure with it too. So one thing we can say straight away, that somehow Marx and Joyce are both interested in the laws of motion of stuff. So, both interested in the laws of motion, whether that would be the way in which commodities undergo particular metamorphoses in the production process or in modes of circulation. And the idea of metamorphoses, or the way in which some form of psychic energy undergoes some form of metamorphosis during the course of a night sleeping, which is what this book, Finnegan's Wake, is essentially about. We've had a day in the life of an everyman kind of Bloom character as a day book. Now we've got Joyce wanted to figure out the language of the night. Now, it could be that he was interested in the language of the night because at this point he only had 10% sight, which is, kind of interesting to think. This was a guy who was essentially 90% blind. He was a kind of blind man. So the idea that he was in the night, but it's also a book that's profoundly about language, because it is this idea, as Lacan said, that the unconscious is structured like language. Well, if the unconscious is structured like language, this is the nearest damn thing we've got to some kind of gibberish language that maybe we're muttering in our sleep. The other thing we might say is, for a man who's 90% blind, the character Earwicker is no coincidence. Earwicker. You can close your eyes when you sleep, but you can't close your ears. And he talks about Earwicker being about, this is ear talk or earwigs. So it's a lot of ideas playing around with language, with sound, and with hearing. And again, this is why I think to get the real beauty, you can get the real beauty of it by reading it to yourself and reading aloud the words to yourself. But if you hear it performed, it can actually be something that's quite remarkable, quite astonishing, if it's performed well. And it just brings it alive with the voices, just incredible. You can hear the Irish lilt, you can hear all kinds of things going on. Is it really a book about one man dreaming throughout the night? Because this guy, H.C. Earwicker, Here Comes Everybody, is another epithet that Joyce uses for him. Is it about a single guy dreaming throughout the night? And that's the big question in Joycean scholarship. Nobody kind of really knows, because it's clear that Joyce wanted to write a book about the night. He told people that. He told Harriet Weaver that he wanted to write a book that was a history of the world, but he wanted to write it from the standpoint of what goes on at night. And this in sleeping world. It's clear that he was writing at a time when Freudian psychology was in vogue, even though Joyce was very, very skeptical about both Jung and Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. In fact, the pun throughout, he talks about when we were young and Freudened, it was one of his puns. The other one, he made a Freudful mistake. So he's going on with these puns of Freud and being a young Freud, a young Freud was one of them when he's talking about the Jungfrau Mountain in Switzerland. So he's not into the way in which either Jung or Freud have dealt with the continent of dreams. Jung wanted to psychoanalyze Joyce, and he refused. Joyce had a daughter called Lucia who was bipolar, and she underwent some therapy with Jung, but it wasn't very successful. And I think that Joyce always held it against him, and always felt that they were, he actually did almost feel like they were both charlatans. So one wonders about whether he wanted to write his own dream book without really considering any of the literature that was around at that point, around Freud and Jung. But nonetheless, I think it's clear to say that this kind of dreaming person, H.C. Earwicker, Here Comes Everybody, is a kind of archetype. And probably the best way I like to read about it is that it's impossible for one man to have all this knowledge, to make all these puns, to bring all these things into your head when you're dreaming. But as a kind of archetype that covers quite a few bases about what goes on maybe in the inner recesses of our imagination, not necessarily even when we were asleep, but just a way in which you can unearth a different continent, as Althusser himself called it, the continent of the unconscious. And what goes on there is it's a little bit like tapping it the way Marx wanted to tap the hidden abode of the working day in chapter 10 of Capital, when it's a set piece that tries to enter that hidden abode, whereas what we've got here is a kind of set piece that's trying to enter the hidden abode of our kind of psychic imagination, and some of the things that make us anxious, and things that go bump in the night. And of course, what goes on throughout this book is punctuated by claps of thunder. So it's a stormy evening. It's also very clear that Earwicker had too much to drink. He's a publican himself. He was a publican and a barkeep of a pub called the Mullingar Inn in Chapel Lizard, which is a suburb of Dublin. And this is where he's a publican. And one of the people who does a good job on explaining some of Finnegan's wake is actually I've forgotten his name now. Anthony Burgess. Anthony Burgess there's a program on YouTube, which was an old documentary from the 80s, and he actually does quite a nice job at explaining it. And he did his own Here Comes Everybody attempt at having a sort of shortened version of Finnegan's Wake and having an extensive commentary around it. So he talks quite well about, I think, about Joyce, just to get some information about what he thinks it's about. But I've been fascinated by this category of Here Comes Everybody, because it always struck me that this was a little bit Marxist too. And I have sort of a little anecdote that in the mid-90s, I used to teach at King's College London, the University of London. And I didn't live very far away. I lived in a tiny little place in central London at Russell Square. And most days I used to walk past the British Museum. And the British Museum has the big Sidney Smirk's reading room, the big dome, 19th century reading room where Marx used to sit. So I had a reader's ticket, and I used to walk into the reading room. In those days, it was open. If you had a card, you could get in there. And G7 was Karl Marx's seat, and it was often nice to kind of get into G7 and sit down. Oddly enough, there never used to be anybody sitting there. Maybe they just felt a little bit too intimidated about sitting down, or maybe they were ignorant that this was Marx's seat, or maybe they didn't want to sit there because it was Karl Marx. Who knows? But I used to go there and sit in G7 and just try to sort of imagine, Marx with his blue books, his inspector's reports piled up, muttering to himself in German, trying to sort of scribble the way he did in his very uncipherable kind of language. His writing was difficult to decipher. But afterwards, I used to walk out, and to walk out of the British Museum in those days, you used to have to walk into a permanent display that was called Literary Treasures. And one of the literary treasures that was there was this glass cabinet that had an open notebook, a big formatted notebook of work in progress, which is what James Joyce was calling Finnegan's Wake. in the 1930s, and it's got this kind of crazy pencil, big pencil. It was big because of his eyesight, and it was just this kind of mad kind of ravings of Joyce penning the notebooks of Finnegan's Wake. And this really used to fascinate me. And I used to think that, that there's some connection here between Finnegan's Wake and Capital, for example. Both of these big, intimidating books, difficult books. Finnegan's Wake's even more difficult to read, if it's readable at all, in fact, if we can say it's a readable book, because it kind of isn't a readable book. There's so much things going on, so many different languages going on, so many puns, that it's quite hard to read it from start to finish. But the thing about it, him and Marx were just kind of nightmares for publishers, particularly when you come to the proof stages, because they kept adding material. They wanted to include everything in it. Not only did they want to sort of talk about Here Comes Everybody, but they wanted to write about everything. Joyce wanted to write about history of the world, which is, no immodest kind of little project that he's setting himself. Marx also wanted, he wanted to lay bare the laws of motion of modern capitalism and modern society. So they had these lofty ambitions that were thought big, continuously added stuff, but were also very hard to understand because both persons' drafts were almost kind of incomprehensible to understand, and to put them in print and then somehow send back the galleys to the author, and then the authors would alter it and change it. It was just an incessant process of adaptation and change and inclusion. And we could say that that's really what Joyce and Marx have in common. The other thing they have in common is this idea of Here Comes Everybody. Marx was almost suggesting that capital, particularly in English capitalism in the 19th century, was a vision of our own future. That all societies, modern societies, would emerge somehow into this state. They would morph into the state. They would follow a certain kind of trajectory as this, and it's a kind of Here Comes Everybody that takes place. Now, Here Comes Everybody, HCE, is this sigla that Joyce uses for Earwicker, but it can almost be a kind of not quite Here Comes Everybody, but maybe a 99% of everybody. That this could be used as a kind of as a political type of understanding. And I remember when the Occupy movement was around, obviously the 99% became the slogan of it in 2011. But I remember flicking through Finnegan's Wake and seeing a word that was called collide or escape. And I thought, God, this is kind of collide or escape. And I don't know what at the time, it was a time when I was looking at a lot of Jackson Pollock paintings. And I remember seeing a Jackson Pollock painting called Number 32 that was painted in 1950, which is Pollock's big year of all his incredible large canvases and his action paintings and his drips on the floor. And I remember thinking that the Number 32 by Jackson Pollock was a kind of pictorial representation of what was going on in the world with Occupy. There were all these occupations throughout the world, from Zuccotti Park around to London, around to, Egypt, Cairo, to Guernsey Park, etc., etc. It seemed like the whole world had gone on fire with Occupy. And there were these kind of nodes that were radiating kind of energy. And particularly with sort of social media, people were keeping in touch. So there was this incredible mosaic of people colliding with the mode, with the sort of with various ruling classes. But there was an escape coming out from it. There was a collision and then there was an escape. But it also looked like a kaleidoscope as well. So this pun that Joyce was using just struck me as just kind of an interesting way to try and visualize and to name some of the kinds of things that were going on. Anyhow, this is what got my imagination going. And I wrote a piece that was published in New Left Review, if anybody wants to have a look at it, in 2011, looking at this idea of here comes everybody, and looking at the idea of the notion of a kaleidoscope. But the words that you can find in Finnegan's Wake, and what you can see here, and how the sort of the laws of motion are in place, it's really quite an incredible book. It's a book that one can really enjoy, particularly if there's no agenda. If you can just flick through it. One of the other words that was in it was, of course, one that Felix Guattari used, which was called chaos moss. Deleuze and Guattari quite liked that, and they ran with that idea. There's many things you can get into, but it is a book that is about laws of motion, is about what goes on in sleep, what are the kind of psychic transformations, metamorphoses that go about in sleep. But also it's a book about rebirth as well. Now it's interesting that both Marx and Joyce are sort of scatological thinkers. The capitalism goes with its worst foot forward. That was an expression that Henri Lefebvre liked to use about capitalism. But it's true of Marx is that it is quite a dark depiction of the kind of rot that's taking place under capitalism, but we have to go through the rot to somehow develop, somehow kind of to resuscitate, to revitalize and to regenerate. And the sort of language that's in Finnegan's Wake bears that kind of thing, even to the likes of Phoenix Park, Phoenix Park, the Phoenix Rising. And Joyce plays around with all kind of scatological kind of terminology. He talks about his words being fermented. He's using a fermented language. Now, both Marx and Joyce were we're not in some ways oblivious to the power of wine and beer. They both like to sup a bit. There were a lot of allusions to Guinness here, to fermentation and to yeast. The ingredient of yeast in the book is here because there are lots of mentions in Finnegan's Wake of fungi. Now it's kind of remarkable the numbers of allusions to mushrooms and fungi that take place in Finnegan's Wake, and just the idea that things are beginning to rot, things ferment, and then they go off, they rot. But actually, during the course of the night, when people say the mushrooms grow, and some people say that mushrooms grow through lightning, you wake up somehow restored, and the mushrooms push up from the rot. And sometimes they have very, very interesting flowers. Sometimes they have great healing powers. If you listen to a lot of mycologists talk about the powers of mushrooms, and about what they can do in terms of how they can detoxify certain environmental waste. One of the stories about Chernobyl, after Chernobyl, the terrible explosion that took place there in the 80s, one of the first things that grew in the contaminated sort of debris, or the really things that were the radiation was a mushroom. So mushrooms push through here in the night. So it's a book which kind of wallows in fermentation and fermented language, and how words can themselves be somehow used to identify stuff and to name things that are growing, things that are actually becoming things that are becoming like the phoenix rising from the dirt, rising from the rot. And it's a kind of terminology that's really very interesting in Finnegan's Wake, in terms of how this notion of things actually working their way through in a very difficult way, but pushing through the other side in something which is actually a lot more positive. Now, one example of we can think of of this here is, what mushrooms are. Now, if you get into, I'm not somebody who's big on mushrooms. There's plenty of mycologists. One of the great mycologists was John Cage, the musician and composer, who also wrote some music about Finnegan's Wake, and he was into mushrooms, and he was also into Finnegan's Wake. But one of the things that mycologists would tell you, that a lot of the stuff that goes on in mushrooms happens under the ground, because mushrooms actually provide energy to different species of trees. Nitrogen, they have particular kinds of networks called mycorrhizal networks, that are these incredible channels that circulate nutrients to trees, and it's operating exclusively underground, and it doesn't actually do it. It's a kind of cooperative network that doesn't favor one species over another. So it kind of plays in a different way to which Darwin's evolutionary theory, where particular species, just look after themselves. What the kind of mycorrhizal networks suggest is that there's a whole system underground that is transformative, and it's a conduit for actually supplying various forms of carbon and nitrogen to make trees strong and to grow and to be healthy in the forest. And the forest there is somehow aided by this underground system that is not visible, but it's happening all the time through various kinds of forms of cooperation, which as a sort of Marxist, it's quite nice to think about something in that way, that there are forms of cooperative networks going on that are operating underground, that maybe one day may push overground, may actually wake up. And when we can think about the title of the book, Finnegan's Wake itself, the wake, Finnegan's Wake, that it is a wake of Tim Finnegan, who's a character who does feature in the book. And Tim Finnegan is a famous Irish pub ballad about Tim Finnegan. He carried a hard to rise up in the world. He carried a hard, yo for the whole with a, and here's the fun in Finnegan's Wake. Have plenty of fun in Finnegan's Wake. It's about an Irish bricklayer, Tim Finnegan, who liked to tip a whiskey. One morning he had a little bit too much. He went up his ladder and he fell down and he died, and he had his wake. And during the wake, somebody spilled some whiskey on him, which is the sort of water of life in Gaelic. And he rises from the dead. And, you think I was dead, and he comes alive again. And it's this idea of Earwicker having a fall at the beginning and actually being resurrected and waking up in the next day. This waking up is a very interesting thing to think about in terms of, not only for a Marxist, when we think about the Internationale, arise ye workers from your slumber. And Olivia Plurabelle at one point says to Earwicker, arise, man of the Hooth, you've slept so long, arise and arouse, and it's this idea of rise up, is to wake up, to awaken, is fascinating. If we read Finnegan's Wake without the apostrophe, why isn't there an apostrophe? Well, maybe it's the Tim Finnegans of the world who we can see as rising up. Now, when you listen to the Irish, to the ballad of Tim Finnegan, it's clear that, that bricklayers, working class Irishmen, often, they need to carry the hard with their bricks to make it in the world, is what they say. So if they work hard, you may rise up in the world, you may become middle class, you may become bourgeois if that's your aspirations. But if perhaps they know that is a fraud and that doesn't happen, maybe you can see the idea of the Finnegans rising as being somehow the Finnegans developing class consciousness and arising like they are urged to arise in the Internationale. So, maybe Joyce is having a little game here that actually is a strange form of mycorrhizal Marxism, dealing with mushrooms and dealing with things that, that go bump in the night, and dealing with psychic states. But actually the point of resurrection and the rising up is a collective Finnegan's, and the interesting thing about it is it's also Anna Olivia Plurabelle tells him to get up. So we know that the sisters out there are also working hard to get the guys to sort of, do something as well through their class consciousness. So it may not be anything to do with what Joyce did intend. It could be, who knows? It could be a socialist artist. He also wanted to write a book for the common person. He didn't choose somebody. He chose a publican, somebody who's a kind of public figure. Who knows lots of people. It's also a little bit about the book itself has so many different languages, and it's so polyglot in its intent and its construction that it almost reminds me a little bit too, and this is where I'll stop, of Marx's idea of world literature in the manifesto. When Marx talks about a world literature and about, this is a kind of literature that comes through the various internationalizations of the world, different translations go into different hands, and it can produce a certain kind of solidarity that goes across national frontiers. And I do think that, this is a book that is so polyglot, does go across so many different frontiers, is so full of kind of ideas, is such a human book, a heartwarming book, a positive book, just as Ulysses is. That this is too. It's we're missing an opportunity if we don't look at it. And I always remember that that what Oscar Wilde said about a book. Oscar Wilde said, to reread a book and to read it again and to reread that book again, is that if you can't reread it and reread it and reread it, it's not worth reading one time at all. And I do think that is how you can categorize Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. And I've spoken for a bit too long, so I'm very grateful for your attention. And I'm sorry if I've bored the shit out of you, but thank you.
Andy, thank you so much. I think we still have 25 folks in the room. The only people who left were people who apologized for leaving, who had something else to do. So I don't think I don't think you bored us at all. And I don't, as far as I can see, no one's asleep. So
oh, no, he's asleep.
And if they are, they're dreaming like Earwicker. So anyone who has a question or a comment or something to add to the conversation, please chime in. I see Previn already has asked to speak. Go ahead, Previn.
Hi, Andy. That was a terrific delivery of Joyce, and I can't argue with anything that you said about the content connection with Marx. And just as a disclaimer to what I'm about to say, I am going to order Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses, which I haven't read since I did my English degree in 1985. Okay, so you've thoroughly shamed me and inspired me, and I'm going to go back and think, what the hell did I miss? Because I missed a lot. Thanks, had some great memories listening to you and your energy. Okay, so now I'm an old man, and I'm kind of trying to understand Marx more and the left a bit more. And so two problems I have with both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. And this valorization of the everyday life, okay? But the problem is that although the content is about every man and everyday life, stylistically, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are very, 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 very elitist. They come out of the stream of consciousness style of writing from Virginia Woolf and Proust. And if you think about Woolf and Proust, I mean, they're so much more accessible to the everyday man, woman, than Joyce's. Joyce is incredibly clever and stylistic, and the whole parody with Ulysses and the Odyssey. It's if you're going to kind of try and get into it beyond the everyday, it's a very middle class book. Ralph Demain in the comments has pointed out that the Stalinists called Ulysses, petty bourgeois. So my first question is coming from Roland Barthes, who talks about the structure of the novel as a way in which the bourgeois try to universalize the world. And in fact, in the process, just spread the lie of the novel that such a thing is possible, that the bourgeois have the universality of the world in their novels, and this is how it can be. And in fact, life is not like that, says Barthes, and the structure of novels is designed to mask what is going on, i.e. poverty, suffering, injustice, inequality, the system of capital, the false consciousness of everyday life, everything that is supposed to be fantastic in Joyce about the everyday life. Marx is saying it's just crap, it's just saturated with the lie of capital. So the novel, in that sense, follows that structural form. And it seems to me that Joyce, if you compare Dubliners, his very, very first set of stories, which I absolutely adored when I was young, and you compare that with the difficulty of reading Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake stylistically, that there is a problem for me that, hey, I'm definitely going to get the books, I'm going to read them, because now I've got time to read them, because I'm kind of middle class myself. But how does this actually help the Marxist cause? I'm not saying, and you've said Joyce wasn't necessarily Marxist, but it does seem to reinforce, the bourgeois position. And if you think about the people who loved Joyce at the time and who were publishing his stuff and who were reading and write about him, it's not HCE, okay? It's not HCE. It's a very narrow set of people who would be inspired by this. So there's the Barthes question, okay, which is that structurally, as a form of the novel, Joyce presents a problem to me, which is that he continues the masking of the bourgeois capital through art, okay? The second, a brief question, relates to Adorno and Adorno's jargon of authenticity. And Adorno, in that book, he's really upset with Kierkegaard. He's really upset with Heidegger. And what he says is that they have interiorized consciousness in such a way and philosophized it and made it so deep and meaningful that we don't have to look at the obvious suffering of human existence, the obvious inequality of capital, the obvious brutalization of that system. So you know what? We can all be mystical and profound and deep, and we can talk about essences and ontology and the being of being and stuff like this, because that way we don't have to talk about, oh my God, it's so shit. And, it's actually so obvious that people are being brutalized. And then we don't have to do anything about it because we can interiorize consciousness. So to the extent that Joyce was working out of the stream of consciousness from Woolf and Proust, isn't he part of the problematic that Adorno is kind of pointing to, which is that, we don't get to the critique of society in Joyce. We don't get to the obvious inequalities, etc., that Marx, in his writing, so kind of explosively and spectacularly delivers.
Yeah, that's, it's a heavy question. It's a great question. It's a heavy question. I don't know where to begin. One thing just struck me when I was hearing it about, there was the old joke about the Irish hod carrier who said, the foreman on the building site says, this guy doesn't know his Joyce from his girder, and he says, yes, I do. One wrote Faust, the other wrote Ulysses. You shouldn't sort of, what I meant by that is you can't underestimate certain people. One of the great things about the James Joyce Society is that actually, if you go to any of these meetings, these are just people from all walks of life who just love literature. That you can still be an activist in the day and read James Joyce at night. The two don't necessarily, cancel each other out. If you're going to sort of, look to James Joyce to aid your activism directly, then, he's not your man. But it's just as Proust isn't, But actually, if you want to sort of, if you want to read a serious book, and you can make the argument about, isn't any novel that's serious and difficult, from Faulkner to Virginia Woolf herself, or anybody writing books that are slightly more challenging, you could argue that are these books for ordinary people? Well, yes. Why wouldn't they be for ordinary people? You see plenty of people reading all kinds of challenging books on all kinds of walks of life. So I don't think you should necessarily suggest that, James Joyce is going to expose capitalism the same way Karl Marx does. It's a kind of ludicrous thing to say, but there's no reason why you can't read both of them and kind of get something from it, as well as, being an agitator and an organizer and trying to sort of, directly, trying to directly do something that is in terms of social justice. But, I think your starting point is you're expecting too much from the novel. The novel's not designed to transform the world. It's designed to actually kind of enlighten people in different ways. One of the great commentaries on that is, what Edmund Wilson said about, in his Triple Thinkers book. There's his chapter on Marxism and literature. He talks about Lenin. Lenin liked to read Turgenev. He said, Turgenev's not very political, but boy, isn't his his handbook on the hunts? What's it called? I can't remember the book now. The huntsman's handbook or notebook. Isn't this the most terrific thing? And Lenin said the same about Tolstoy as well. That these guys are great. Marx had a thing about Heine. Heine, he kind of turned a blind eye on Heine because his writings were so wonderful. He knew he has some kind of problems with him. I think if you're going to read any text, particularly the novel, with the expectation that you're going to try to sort of, finding the antidote to the horrors of capitalism, it's asking too much of the book. I think I have an issue when you're reading a book that's necessarily escaping that, or actually suggesting that it's something different. But I think that most of the great novels tend to be revealing something about the human condition and a particular history, or even a particular person, that actually, is grist to your mill. If you want to think about it and use it and develop it, you can learn a lot about people, and you can learn a lot about what it means about being, what solidarity might be about. So I don't need to talk about essences and beings and a lot of academic jargon, which you actually invoked, which I don't use. I'd never do. It's why I never publish in an academic journal, because I kind of think it's a waste of time. So I actually kind of think that the people who are working on it, the Adornos and those things, they're the people who are wasting our time. It's the novels where you've got the insight, and that's what ordinary people read. They don't read Adorno. I don't like Adorno because he didn't like jazz, and I'm a jazz fan, so Adorno's gone. But actually, when it comes to Proust is a really interesting guy, because you're right. That he is easier to read than Joyce. But if you look at pictures of Proust with his dressed in black with a little black moustache, if you put a bowler hat on him, he'd be a dead ringer for Bloom. And his politics are quite similar in a way. They were both of moderate temperament, but they actually were both, they both spoke out about injustice. Proust spoke out about Dreyfus. Bloom, as a fictional character, stood up to the Cyclops. They're both, Bloom had a Jewish father, Proust has a Jewish mother. They both felt the Jewish heritage as a minority. They were both actually quite interesting in terms of the way in which they were dialectical opposites. Bloom walks around Dublin all day. Marcel sits in his bed listening to all the street noises outside. If you read the beginning of The Prisoner, it's one of the most wonderful kind of pieces of writings you'll read ever, when he's waking up in the morning, a little bit like Earwicker, and he talks about knowing what kind of time what the weather is outside, because you can tell by the street noises whether they're muffled. If it's muffled, it's probably rainy. If the shaft of light coming through the curtains is a little bit dimmed, he knows it's grey and rainy. But if he hears the trams along Boulevard Haussmann going quite purely and crisply, he knows it's going to be a nice day. And he said he understood that he didn't have to leave his bed to understand what was going on in the street. He was lying in bed while Bloom was out at 8 a.m. getting his kidneys for breakfast. So it's you can make of it what you will. The important thing is that I think if you're looking for it through absolutely tangentialist lenses, you're going to be disappointed. Which is why people were heckling Eisenstein when he started to lecture on James Joyce and Soviet, in Soviet communism, because they thought it was bourgeois. So I just disagree. In short.
The thematic thing. If I can just quickly come back, the thematic.
Previn, thanks. Other people would like to speak first, so let's go to Steve Knight first. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Fred. Steve Knight, and thanks, Andy. It was a wonderful presentation. Just a short observation here that I was thinking that if you look at the lives of Marx and Joyce, they were both migrants. Marx gradually migrated from east to west, and Joyce went in the opposite direction. He started out in Ireland and went roughly west to east. And I'm just wondering here if the part of the connection here, it makes me think of, Marx's prediction that we would eventually have a world economy controlled by capital. And you look at the migrations that Marx and Joyce took, it's kind of prescient about the kind of statelessness that may be increasingly a feature of the world economy. I just wondered if you might have a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, and I think it's true. It's Marx several times applied to be a British citizen, and he got rejected each time. Joyce always had a British passport, which is quite an astonishing fact, really, and it always surprises a lot of people. He didn't have an Irish passport; he had a British passport. You think, well, why was that? And I think, well, I'm not sure he was too bothered really about the idea of nationalism. Why didn't he have an Irish passport? He did support home rule. He did have this Irishness about him, but he lived abroad elsewhere. He self-exiled, and he became polyglot. I was looking at volume 2 of Capital yesterday, just with the idea of thinking about Finnegan's Wake vis-a-vis the circulation of Capital in volume 2. And I read Engels's preface, and Engels says somewhere about this massive notes that Marx made in different kind of languages. Some of it was in French, some of it was in English, it was in German, he was put bits of Greek, there was coarse language, there were his own made-up words. And I was thinking, this just sounds like Finnegan's Wake. But it's only somebody who's experienced several cultures would have that knowledge. Obviously, the other unifying point with them was they were both very poor during the course of their lives. They required on support from fairly wealthy benefactors, Frederick Engels from Marx and various Harriet Weaver and Sylvia Beach, various people who supported amongst other people. So it came at a cost. It also came at a cost for their kids as well. I think they, both Giorgio and Lucia struggled with being nomadic. So there were great costs to it. And one of the theories is that Lucia's schizophrenia and mental illnesses were caused because she didn't know whether she was coming or going. They went to live in Zurich when they'd been living in Trieste, where they were born and spoke Italian, and they had to go to school in German. So they had to go back 2 years. Both of them, I think, became Italian citizens. In fact, Giorgio became a German citizen. He lived in Germany for most of his life. So it does cause the dislocation causes richness, but and a perspective which is quite fascinating and important and global and international, but it also does come at certain domestic costs as well, I think.
Okay, anyone else? I don't see anyone else on Stack in the chat. Here is Alana. Alana, go ahead.
I really don't have anything particularly profound to say, partly because I have not, other than Portrait of the Artist, I haven't read Joyce, and I only want to comment that as someone who reads a lot of literature, I have always felt incredibly intimidated by the idea, conceptually of Ulysses. However, I think you've swung me over to your side, and I will read. I've been encouraged, but I said it. I find it, I don't mind a challenging novel. I love great literature, so now I think I have to
listen to it. Get it.
I have to listen to it. Yeah,
listen to it.
I think I have
during
to
the day when you're just doing stuff. Yeah.
Find my copy and thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I know for a fact that Alana has read Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. So
I've read Gravity's Rainbow too. That's a great one. I do have this fantasy of talking about Gravity's Rainbow and Capital, and also Finnegan's Wake, but it's the Gravity's Rainbow is fantastic.
Yeah.
You just scheduled your next MEP appearance. So.
Oh, right. Oh, jeez.
And I also wrote a comment in chat when you were talking about mushrooms and the importance and mushrooms. I don't know if it's mushrooms as a metaphor or whether in Finnegan's Wake he actually talks explicitly about mushrooms. But of course, I couldn't help thinking about hallucinogenic mushrooms, since it seems like Finnegan's Wake is a pretty psychoactive kind of experience reading it. So
exactly, one wonders whether he has been eating magic mushrooms. Yeah, some magic Shep mushrooms which go down well with the dry Swiss white wine.
There you go.
Yeah.
Andrew,
yes.
You're next. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is a really great presentation. I just wanted to ask a question regarding the way that you're discussing Joyce's way of dealing with the everyday, and how there's this kind of tradition of, I think it's an Althuserian thinking as well, about a kind of critique of being absorbed in the, say, seductive, hypnotic, even in Debord's critiquing spectacle, and how it's so much that it prevents, let's say, revolutionary radical organization, because we're so absorbed in this thick atmosphere of the news and all that. I just want to refer to one thing, which is you might be familiar with Kluge and Knox's book, the German Marxist theorists, about the role of the public space.
Yeah.
And their argument being that just quickly, that public space was so important for Kant and for all the German idealists, but they didn't really realize, Kant that is, that it would become dominated essentially by capitalist forces.
Yeah.
So we have media, we have cartoons, we have entertainment. And one of the things that I think is so wonderful in Joyce's books is this how can I put it, like vernacular, common language, common way of speaking, talking. And in a way, I wondered if you could speak about this issue that I sometimes see arising. I don't know what I think about it anymore, which is sort of different than Beckett, is how that world of like everyday common speech and common thought is being treated by Joyce. Because in some ways he twists it, and in other ways you could argue that there's a kind of fetishization, a kind of like over absorption, repeating that absorption. And I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, the question of everyday is, I think it's important to stress that, Joyce wasn't consciously writing about every day necessarily. Obviously, only Lefebvre points that out when he consciously writes about every day. And when we're talking about, 1904 Dublin and what it would be like walking around, New York City in 2022, and the kind of absorption of images and advertising and ideology, and the way in which you're just worn down by it everywhere you go.
Right.
Some form of capitalist activity that just pulverizes your brain sometimes. It's quite difficult to get away from it. So it's clear that we're dealing with a much more reified, a much more intense everyday life for a lot of people, because they're on the move as well, and probably much more than they were there. They could possibly be out less in the public realm. One possibility. I don't know. One of the fascinating things that is about pubs is that you're kind of forced to sort of argue in a pub with people. If you come into kind of they can. It sounds a little bit silly, but they do become sort of arbiters. I remember when I in Liverpool when I was a student and growing up there and going to the pub, it would be a place where you would assassinate politicians because they're just kind of morons, and you'd have these heated arguments about what's what. So there were places that were almost safety valves for releasing emotional releases, that you would, in other words, it would be protection somehow, buffer from the nonsense that you hear politicians spout, the fake news, the rigged election, Brexit's going to do this, going to do that, on and on and on and on, across the world, from Hungary to India, and via Brazil, and it's relentless. But there was we've almost seemed to have lost some of these spaces that that exist. I did a Zoom conference early last year about a bar, an Irish bar in Washington Heights, on 168th Street and Broadway, very near to the Coogan's. Yeah, thank you, Coogan's. And you know, the guy there, who's a wonderful guy called Peter Walsh, who was one of the co-owners. He studied Irish literature way back, which he's a barkeep who's read Ulysses. He's not he is a sophisticated thinker, but he's a man that could easily figure in a Joseph Mitchell story. And it was, you know, that was places where, you know, they brokered Dominican local politicians when there was riots there, when there was a crack war in the early 90s, and when it was difficult to walk out in a neighborhood. But then it became this kind of shamrock salsa type of blues bar that was welcoming for everybody. And it was a kind of place that in a way it's closed down since. It closed under the first lockdown in March 20 of last year, the first COVID lockdown. It's kind of a place where you would discuss stuff, and if you're coming out with stupid things, or you read something on the news which is inane, rather than just go home and internalize it, you know, people would say, you know, this is kind of stupid. So it seemed like the public realm, in a way maybe that Joyce was depicting it in Ulysses, has been altered to such a degree that everyday life is much more interiorized, it's much more at home, it's much more secluded, it's much more, in some ways, downright anti-public. And of course, when in a pandemic, that exacerbated even more, which makes in some ways even more fair game every time you switch on the TV or you switch on your radio for some kind of propaganda that's beaming out there that is there. Obviously, there are ways in which you can switch channels or not put the TV on or listen to NPR or do something. But it's clear that everyday life is completely overwhelmed with ideology that's actually creating a kind of Althusserian interpolation. And if you get to the pub, sometimes maybe you can sort of, you know, it could be a corrective, or if you're reading stuff, it can correct it. But it is very difficult to think about that. You know, the world that we live in a way, you mentioned Beckett, it does function a little bit more like Beckett. You have to say, you know, Beckett's endgame probably is the play of our generation, rather than Ulysses. It is about sort of, you know, the end of the world, living in a gloomy four walls that you can't go out because you're in quarantine and you've got to sort of deal with it, you know. You know, that is, you know, that is a little bit, what's the line when Ham says, you know, have you had enough of it? And he got, and Clove says, yes. And then afterwards he says, of what? You know, but you kind of get the sense, you know, you know what he means. Have you had enough of it? You know, of what? You know, Trump, global capitalism, environmental destruction, you know, the list goes on. So it's the Joyce Beckett parallax is of interest. And Joyce was always adding, as I said, obviously Beckett's was always taking away. Lessness was his motto, I think, wasn't it? In terms of how to strip things down into the bare essence. So we can read them both, I think. Beckett for another occasion. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else at all would like to join the conversation? Okay. Seeing none, I will. Oh, here's Thomas Smith with his hand up. Please go, Thomas. We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm trying to start my video. Okay, so I am a doctoral student of the late great Marshall Berman.
My good friend Marshall.
You're a big fan of his.
Marshall's my hero.
But I had a deep antagonism with him writing my dissertation because he was on Lewis Mumford. And I tended to side with Mumford and also Perry Anderson against Berman.
He's not going to like you. Marshall's not going to like you.
Well, I finally succeeded in getting it finished anyway, against many of his scribblings in the margins. But I want to chime in with people who said before about how it seems like the authors like Berman and Lefebvre, they tend to valorize everyday life, and they're not looking really to, as Perry Anderson said, to punctuate this moment of modernity with building a revolutionary movement. I wonder if you would comment.
Well, I mean, I love Marshall dearly, and I've written quite a lot about him, including a kind of book. So, I was terribly upset when Marshall died, and I still keep in touch with Shelley, his widow. So I saw her a few months ago. Marshall was just a very important figure for me. But I do remember one occasion when in fact, it was this. I remember buying this edition of Finnegan's Wake. I bought it from Murder Inc. because in those days I used to live on West 93rd Street, and he was living up on West End at between 100 and 101st. And I said, I just got another copy of Ulysses today from this store called Murder Inc. I don't know whether anybody remembers the mystery bookstore on Broadway, around about West 93rd, called Murder Inc. But I just bought a nice copy of Finnegan's Wake, and I just said, have you ever read Finnegan's Wake? And because I knew he was a Ulysses man. He said, no, I've never really gotten into Finnegan's Wake. It was always Ulysses. And I remember almost 30 years ago now hearing Marshall read out that passage of Stephen Dedalus talking about a shout in the street. And as you know, from all that solid melts into air, that's one of the key points. But just talking about Perry Anderson's 1984 little sort of encounter they had with each other. I mean, in a way, they were talking different languages. They're talking different Marxisms. Perry Anderson was right on every note. In his critique about the idea that capitalism, that revolution would end modernity, not make it continue, and there's punctuation points in different types of periodization that you can make in the trajectory of modernism that Marshall never did. But Marshall was never really interested in that. He, as his great friend, the late literary critic John Leonard used to say, he was the man with the kaleidoscope eyes who traveled with a shadow passport. And a lot of the world that he was talking about, whether it be Paris, even New York, was in his own imagination. Mm-hmm. And it was a kind of normative world that he had in his brain about what things could be. And he always saw the best of everybody and the best of things, even people who were aggressive to him. He really didn't like the Perry Anderson piece. And the other question that was asked by Bravin earlier about isn't it a bourgeois activity? Well, Perry Anderson is a kind of Mandarin Marxist. It's so pure that as Marshall said, there's no room to breathe, which is fine if you like. But he says, it's clear that Perry Anderson wants some friends because he hasn't got many. And that was Marshall at his most vicious. Marshall was the most endearing character in the world. But if he didn't like you on a piece of paper, he could tear you apart, as he did with several people, including Richard Sennett. I remember was another one of his kind of people he didn't like. But he was sympathetic to Mumford. Surely I couldn't imagine that he would. Some of the Mumford Jane Jacobs debate. He would be sympathetic to Mumford. I can't imagine that he wouldn't have some sympathy for Lewis Mumford. But in terms of the Anderson, he just didn't like Perry Anderson because he didn't come from the working class. He didn't like that kind of English Marxism, and I didn't either. And it was always a problem for me because I came from England, but I didn't come from that part of the world. I wasn't a bourgeois sort of somebody living on a trust fund. I came from Liverpool, and the diction of Joyce's Ulysses, the bar talk, sounds more like the talk I hear in my ear. My ear talk is more like that than Perry Anderson's, who speaks about 15 different languages. I can say these things because he's not going to listen to me, I know, so there's no danger of him taking offense. But it strikes me as being not wrong, but again, it's so pure that it leaves you with nothing in the meanwhile. And I think Marshall was always interested about how you could form a community and a society that would always be a work in progress, if you want to use the Joycean thing. So whilst you could criticize some of his Marxism sometime for not being Marxist enough, his agenda was just, was slightly different. I could talk about Marshall for another 2 hours, but because I loved him so much. So I'm not very objective in my views.
Thank you.
Okay, so then, Andy, we're going to do an event on Pynchon and Beckett and Marshall Berman. So
all right, sounds good. All at once. I don't
maybe
think
not all at once.
No. Thank
Okay,
you,
so
thank
we
you,
are,
everybody. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for asking me to come. And I've had a nice time thinking about these things, and I hope people have as well, and not being too much for you to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And also, we want to let everybody know that we will be making a video available, and we hope you'll share it with any of your people, any people you know who might be inclined but haven't yet to read Ulysses.
and keep an eye on our website, marxedproject.org, marxedproject.org, for more events like this and other events as well, and classes and series on Marxist ideas. So thanks again. And
thank you, Fred. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.